Hi, this is Rama Lakshmi, and I'm here to talk about the hot button issue of Indian history and Hinduism with author and historian Manu Pillai. And we're living through an era where we're constantly reminded that Indian history in the last 1,000 years has all been about an endless cycle of invasion, conversion on an endless loop. And this into this bitterly fought public history over Hinduism, religion, identity, and colonialism. Manu Pillai has just dropped a book, and it's a controversial book. It definitely a controversial subject title: "Gods, Guns, and Missionaries: The Making of the Modern Hindu." Well timed. But tell me something, how will this book contribute to the ongoing public history debate about Hinduism and colonial rule, and of course, the last 1,000 years and politics of conversion? Will it help us understand how we reached this place today?
I think that is the goal of the book. The goal of the book is to understand we do live in the age of Hindutva, right? And how did we get here? The book isn't about Hindutva. The book really ends with the rise of Hindutva. But the book essentially is my quest to understand what paved the way to this. And of course, colonialism was an important factor. Religious debate was an important factor. And it wasn't just the British Raj. The story really begins with the Portuguese and this encounter between Europeans and European power and Hindu society. It's about Christianity and politically backed Christianity. Christianity as a religion could exist even under Hindu rulers. But Christianity, when it's politically backed by European forces, by European political power, how that ends up having an impact on Hindu society and how Hindu society responds to it. So I think it's that tension between foreign power and a religion that's backed by that foreign power and the local religious system and culture, and what happens when the two come face to face. Sometimes lots of creative, innovative things happen on both sides. There's a kind of reinterpretation of Christianity, there's a reinterpretation of Hinduism, there's something really innovative about that. But equally, there is also conflict, equally, there is also quarreling, equally, there is also fighting over identity, over God, over competing ideas of divinity. What does it mean to believe in God? Is it one God? Is it many gods? Who is a monotheist? Who is not? What is actually the nature of the world? Etc. etc. So it's really a multi-layered effort to understand what happened over those last 400, 500 years that leads up ultimately to the birth of Hindutva.
The modern Hindutva.
Modern Hindutva and the modern Hindu identity.
Right. I just finished reading the book yesterday, and really fascinating book. There's one other thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is, we're constantly told that there is a sense of, being wronged as Hindus, right? This Hindu victimhood narrative is pretty dominant, and how the last few hundred years has been about these assaults on the Hindu faith. And yet, when I read your book, it's mostly about Hindu resilience and how the Hindus fought back. And in fact, you write how the Hindus stubbornly resisted and opposed and refused external instruction. So you're almost like you've portrayed them as resilient warriors, survivors. What is the truth? Were Hindus victims, or were Hindus resilient? I need to understand where we should position the Hindus from the last few hundred years.
I don't think it's a binary between either this or that. History is always a complicated affair. What you see, especially under colonialism, is certainly, remember, there was one entire generation of British colonizers in India who were very pro-Hindu culture, if I were had to paraphrase it. They were smashing coconuts at temples, they were making donations to Devis, giving donations at Tirupati to the Padmanabha Swami temple in Trivandrum, participating in Hindu rites, commissioning astrologers to decide things for them. Because they wanted, at that stage of colonialism, they wanted to fit in with Hindu society. Even when the Peshwas in Maharashtra were defeated by the British, one of the first things they did was to instate the Maratha Chhatrapati in Satara and say that, look, we are rescuing you from the control of the Peshwas, who were officially premiers of the state. So at that juncture, the colonial state really wanted to fit in with Hindu society. But then there are events happening in Britain also. There's a rise of evangelicalism there. There's a kind of new form of Christianity that emerges in this period. And when that happens, it shifts. Then it becomes about evangelical attacks on Hinduism. to which Hindus are also responding. Remember, even in colonized societies, even when you're completely under foreign rule, there is no such thing as abject surrender. There is always a form of resistance. In my earlier book, False Allies, for example, I spoke about how the princely states, even though technically they were allies of the Raj and under the Raj, there were creative ways in which they resisted British inroads into their states. So, also, under colonial rule, there were very creative strategies through which Hindu thinkers and Hindu society tried to push back against evangelical Christianity. It's not really a story of some kind of siege of Hinduism, some kind of war on Hinduism, that kind of thing. The British didn't have that kind of total power either. Yet it was influential, yet it did cause a kind of soul searching in Hindu society. It did result in calls for reform, and it did result in a new framing of what it means to be Hindu and what Hinduism itself is.
So we will one by one, many interesting things you said, and one by one we'll unpack it. So you're looking at the colonial period beyond just commerce and power, but you're looking at conversion as one of the central motives. And you've quoted Dalhousie saying, religious conversion into Christianity actually gives it a taller purpose, gives colonialism a taller purpose. And yet you say he didn't want to seem to be very keen on conversion. And all this is happening around the time of Enlightenment in Europe, where there was this sense of, the church has failed the test of rationality, as you call it, and the key words in the Enlightenment era were curiosity and discovery and reason. So, were they discovering India in order to make it, remake it in their own frame? Or was there actually a sense of, let's take from India and maybe there's an exchange? What was going on? There's just so many things that was going on. Conversion project, Enlightenment project, discovering a new faith. Tell me about this puzzle. Where did what fit?
A lot of this, there are stages to this, right? So even when the first missionaries come to India, at first they're seeing a very alien culture. They're seeing something they don't recognize at all. They're convinced that all Hindu gods are monsters. They're convinced that these are all representations of Satan sitting in Hindu temples, because that's the immediate encounter they have, and they are placing what they're seeing, something they don't know, in their worldview, which is that there is God and then there's Satan, and this must be satanic because only we know God. That's the attitude they have at first. Then there's a little bit more exposure and they start saying, okay, hold on. Clearly there's a theology to this. Clearly this culture has its own inner rationale and logic. We need to study this. Conversion is still the goal, but there's a willingness to try and appreciate what the local culture is about. Then you have something like the Protestant Reformations happening in Europe, the Enlightenment. There were multiple Enlightenments, as we now put it, but broadly speaking, there's a phase of the rise of reason and rationality and all of these new qualities by the 18th century. In fact, there's a whole set of intellectuals in Europe who say that actually we're going against the church. We think the church has got it wrong. Let's go and see what the Hindus have in their philosophy that will help us support our project of reason and rationality and a new conceptualization of God, etc. So different types of Europeans and at different junctures and different points in history are looking at Hindu society for different things. One set of people comes and sees monsters. Another set of people comes and sees great, sublime philosophy and wonderful things. And these are often happening in parallel. Sometimes they're happening at different times. So it's a bit of a mess. It's a bit of too many things happening all at once.
So there are two very interesting things in your book. One is this German missionary who comes here, and he's fascinated by what he finds here, and he writes a book called The Genealogy of Indian Gods, and he wants to publish it, and he sends it back to Europe, and they reject it. They refuse to publish it, and they in fact admonish him, saying, we sent you there to take our ideas to India, but you're bringing Hindu ideas to Europe. There's that. And then there is this other bit about the binary that many of these people created between what you call the lesser Hinduism and the higher Hinduism. Higher Hinduism being the philosophy, the philosophical bedrock of the faith, which is the Vedas and the Upanishads, and then the everyday ritualistic Hinduism. And you seem to suggest that they were rejecting the latter, which is the everyday Hinduism, and they appropriated or they traveled with the higher Hinduism. So these exchanges, tell us a little more about these two exchanges, the German guy and then these binary.
Yeah, on the binary, one reason they were so interested in Hindu philosophy is that the framing of the Upanishads, although the Upanishads are also diverse, there's lots happening in there. Yet there were elements of Hindu philosophy that they in Europe as enlightened folks, as people who believed in monotheism, they found certain parallels between what they believed at home and between philosophical Hinduism. And they thought, okay, here's something that's interesting, and maybe we need to explore more of this. And remember, Europe had this narrative, especially after the Protestant Reformation, that there was religion, there was scripture, it got corrupted under the Catholic Church, and that's why you needed the Reformation. And they, in a sense, apply that lens to India as well, which is that, look, here there is pristine Hinduism in the Upanishads. It's about the abstract divinity. It's about, God in his highest sort of conceptualization. It's about ideas. And then somehow, when we actually come to India, we're seeing temples, we're seeing mantras, we're seeing bells and rituals that we don't understand, goat sacrifices, and so on. So they started saying that, okay, here also there was a decline from some kind of pristine purity onto some kind of a mess. And that's why they started prioritizing that older version, or as they put it, or that pristine, pure version of Hinduism over the living culture of the Hindus. That's essentially the binary they create. Which is not to say that they imposed it on Hindus, because within Hinduism also there were always purists who believed in the so-called higher precepts rather than popular Hinduism. For example, there were Hindu schools where they would say that God is just the abstract idea of God. Shiva, Vishnu, etc. are all like manifestations of
One
that
is
God.
supposed to lead you to the abstraction.
To the abstraction. There is, intermediate sort of steps to that point. Others will say, no, actually Shiva or Vishnu or Devi, one of these is the God and the others are all sort of subordinates. So some people personify God in one of these deities. Some people say, no, God is an abstract. And then you have a genealogy coming all the way. This is what Ziegenbach does. That's the name of that German guy. Does all the way, he studies this genealogy all the way to the village level, the Grama Devatas. Your local village goddess of smallpox to whom you're sacrificing goats and so on. So he tries to sort of create structure for a lot of these things. But Hinduism itself is a composite religion. It doesn't come out of one source, right? It's a conglomerate. It's a kind of confederacy of sorts.
It's a collectively curated religion.
It has one explanatory framework, but it's many things in that explanatory framework. Now, this binary happens because of Europeans, but as I said, there were enough ingredients within Hinduism to support and Indians appropriating some of that binary. So a lot of the reformers of the 19th century who tried to reform Hinduism and give it its modern shape, Ram Mohan Roy being one of the prime examples of this, they appropriated part of that Western gaze, but also that aspects that match that gaze within Hinduism and try to fuse it and create a modern Hinduism. Others reject it. There are others who say, no, we do feel that the heart of Hinduism is in the rituals, is in the temples, is not merely an abstracted philosophy. It is in living culture.
And this higher Hinduism, quote unquote, higher Hinduism, how far did it travel into Europe? What kind of impact did it have?
Again, at the point of the Enlightenment, people like Voltaire, in France, for example, they were very besotted with the idea of the Vedas and what the Vedas contained. None of them actually read the Vedas, but they were convinced that the Vedas somehow held monotheistic ideas that predated the Bible, that predated revealed religion, and they often used what they thought of as Hindu ideas in their fight against the church. So remember, it's not just Christianity's impact on Hinduism, but in many ways, what Europeans thought of Hinduism and what they saw of Hinduism, how that impacted dynamics in Europe as well.
Can you give me a specific example where they used ideas from the Vedas to counter the church?
I mean, Voltaire, as I mentioned, is a prime example. He, in fact, got a rather spurious text called the Ezur Vedam. It was a complete forgery, ironically created by missionaries. But he tried to use that in his battles against the church in Europe, without even realizing that this was actually a missionary production. And that's the big interesting thing about Hinduism, right? Because it's such a diverse faith, it's got such an archive of ideas. Even in the scriptures, there's just so much happening that different people could read different things into it. You take the Vedas alone, missionaries will go into it and they'll look at the oldest parts of the Vedas and say, oh, you've got invocations to Agni, Indra, all these diverse gods. This is all polytheism. Others who are anti-church in Europe itself will look at the Upanishads and the philosophical side, which talks about one idea of God, and says, no, the Vedas are actually about monotheism. It's about one God, and it's much better than biblical ideas or much better than what the Christian world has to offer. So in the same corpus of scripture, you've got different people reading different things into it. And Voltaire is an example of it. Ziegenbach, as I said, comes here as a missionary, discovers that actually he doesn't feel as hostile as he was meant to. And he's sort of criticized for it. There was an Italian called Roberto de Nobili who came in the 17th century to Madurai. He also, read the Vedas, learned Sanskrit, and although he wasn't completely supportive, he said, I think his exact quote was that it's like a dung heap with a few like gems here and there. The book has the exact wording, but he said there is something of value here, even if as a Christian I don't fully approve of everything that's in it.
Right.
So different people read different things into it.
So that leads us to the next question, which is about the multiplicity and the plurality of the Hindu faith, right? This is a time when they came and they found different ways of different gods, as you said, different deities, gods, different rituals. There was no one book, there was no one god, so it didn't have that oneness to it. And you would have thought, I mean, this kind of staggering diversity within a faith almost makes it look disorganized and would have been easiest to occupy and convert. Your book suggests that it was this diversity, that it was this plurality of Hindu faith that acted in its favor. And they even talk about, this competitive spiritual marketplace. And the Hindus are almost telling them, you want to come and operate here, but do not capture it. And your book talks about how the Hindus stubbornly resisted and refused external instruction. So you're saying it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Regimentation is necessary for survival, as some would say, but this multiplicity helped us. So how did it help us? And what do we derive from that for the 21st century India now?
One pattern that comes across at different periods, different missionaries talking in different parts of India with different Hindus. A lot of them Brahmins, but a lot of them non-Brahmins also. They always come across this Hindu attitude, which is to say that God has created multiple ways to find him. And we accept that yours is one way, but it's not our way. We have a different way. Whereas for missionaries, naturally, because they are in a foreign country to propagate their faith, they say, no, this isn't a buffet where you can go and pick what you want from a menu. God is one, which means that God could only have revealed one way to him. All the other ways are necessarily wrong. But then, the Hindus would counter argue and say that's not possible, because if God meant it for everybody, then why didn't he give it to everybody? Why is it that he gave it only to you in Europe and that you have to bring it to us like this? We've got, just as Christ was born in your part of the world, or is accepted by you as God's representative, so too Vishnu was born in his 10 incarnations here. We consider that our path to God. And you find this at different generations, different centuries, essentially the same argument being made. That we are not saying yours is wrong, we're just saying that it is one among many paths, whereas the missionary claim was often that this is the path.
And that helped the Hindu faith.
But I think what happens is that with colonialism coming in, is when Hindus start hardening their attitude a little bit. Till power is in the hands of Hindu rajas, etc., it doesn't really matter, because these are just academic debates. Missionary conversion also, the numbers are often relatively low. What happens is when the state itself becomes influenced by evangelical motives, which happens in the 19th century in the British, not easily. There's a lot of resistance within the British East India Company also to this new attitude that's emerging. Once that happens, you start seeing more and more fortification on the side of the Hindus, a kind of regimentation. Because essentially that's when that siege feeling essentially starts appearing, where you feel that, okay, the state seems to support this. Before the Great Rebellion, etc., that you have cases where they ask that how is it that Christian fathers can go out to melas and outside temples and preach if the state is not supporting them? It's not possible, right? When Awadh is annexed, there were rumors that the East India Company is going to send a whole platoon of missionaries into Awadh to convert everybody. There was this great suspicion once we came under British rule that there was always an effort to convert people to Christianity. That's when the regimentation becomes more and more of a real thing, and that's why I said this. It sort of paves the way to Hindutva. That hardening of attitudes, the feeling that, okay, we need to now become defensive about faith, that becomes a way to justify resistance to Christian missionaries and evangelical motives.
And that started in the 19th century.
Yes,
that
largely.
Hardening.
Of course, rejection of what the missionaries were saying happens much before. From the Portuguese period itself, you see it. In Goa, in fact, under Portuguese rule, where there was a certain amount of forced conversion and so on, you already see very creative ways in which Hindus are capable of resisting it. For example, your god has to leave a certain village because it's no longer safe there. They'll take it outside Goa, build an even bigger temple for the deity there, which is a way of saying that, okay, we had to leave that place, but here we are flaunting our religion in even grander style. People who were forced to convert, Brahmins devised ways to reconvert them. And there were ways in Goa also where they were able to, but Goa was relatively small scale. It happened in one small part of the country, and of course that was also a complicated tale. People convert for various reasons. We have one case where a Brahmin had a lover from a lower caste community, in quotes, and he couldn't marry her obviously as a Hindu, so he and she converted so they could get married.
That happens
So
even today.
yeah, so people can convert for various motives. But by the 19th century, with British power looking entrenched, with British power controlling so much of India, it became more and more of a threat. That's when you have this great appetite to somehow define the contours of Hinduism and be able to push back and say, no, this is not going to work.
And that's where this using the European mirror to look at yourself, and when they started defining the contours, they also started tweaking, right? And was that tweaking done with Europe in mind or the European gaze in mind? And can you tell me about this mirror and what kind of distortions did that or changes did that bring to the faith?
So what happens is that by the 19th century, Indian intellectuals are also looking at European ideas. It's a two-way street, right? Just as Indian ideas are going into Europe and European intellectuals are mining Hinduism for their battles and their intellectual debates in Europe, so too there are Hindu minds here who are also actively consuming a European framework. They want to understand how the modern world is shaping up. All said and done, they can see that the British are technologically ahead. They're the ones in power in the country, which means something is enabling them to sort of control an alien country and hold it under in their grasp. So there is a kind of acceptance of new concepts. So under Ram Mohan Roy, etc., figures like this almost implicitly recognize that religion, as it's defined in its dominant framework by the West, features books, features a philosophical set of ideas, it features a certain kind of dogma, and they're trying to see how Hinduism can be made to fit that mold. So what you have is what you refer to as a European mirror is essentially a mold of conceiving faith and religion. And what Hindus have is, traditionally they have a religious system that has a very different evolution. It's, as you said, it's a living, breathing organism. It has no fixed contours. It's a diverse tradition. It has a common explanatory framework that comes from the Puranas, etc. There's an attempt towards a unified way to understanding it. But there isn't one solid mold within which it's placed. It's a much more sort of loose and amorphous system. But under colonial pressures and exposed to modern education, exposed to English ideas, the English language, etc., a lot of reformers in India who are conscious reformers, they start trying to put Hinduism in this modern mold. And that's where they start prioritizing texts, because you have the Bible, you have the Quran. What is the text of the Hindus? Is it the Vedas? Is it the Gita? These debates emerge, and the Gita becomes very popular as the sort of handbook of Hinduism. Partly because the Gita was also very popular in Europe. So when, on the one hand, you have missionaries attacking your religion, on the other hand, you have European intellectuals who are besotted with the Gita, and you realize, okay, here, the Gita is our text, it's a traditional text, we've inherited it, but it's also something that Europe appreciates, which means we can use it against missionary pressures and say, no, these are our ideas. Whatever superstition you're seeing in lived Hindu culture and practice, forget that. The Gita is the idea. You have intellectuals saying things like, it doesn't matter what the average Hindu does. They may sacrifice goats or whatever. Christianity isn't understood on the basis of what the average Christian does, because then every Christian murderer should be held against the Christian faith as a kind of yardstick, right? If you don't do that for Christianity, so too for Hinduism, you should look only at the textual ideas and not at the living culture. So what's happening is that you're internalizing the gaze to a certain extent, but also remember, you're not doing it passively. You're not doing it in a way that you've just bought that wholesale and now you've been somehow, reinvented by Europeans. No. You've brought in that gaze, but you're using it for your own purposes to push back against the people who brought that gaze in the first place. Do you see what I mean? It's a bit like...
Yeah, I was going to ask you,
Yeah.
was it a counter to colonialism, or was it to save Hindu faith and give it, or was it one to get their approval, saying, look, we too have a text, we too have these ideas, it's not just this. Was it an approval thing, or was it to push them back?
See, again, it's not an either or. I'll answer through an analogy. So when the freedom struggle begins in India, the nationalist movement, the late 19th century, the very first, this is an example I often give, the very first circular calling for that Indian National Congress in 1885 says all the delegates have to speak the English language, because there's no other common language that brown people can speak to each other if they're going to stand up to the British. So what do you see here? English language, the colonizer's language, the colonizer's grammar book, but it is appropriated and subverted to stand up to the colonizer, right? So it's possible to borrow a concept from somebody else, use it for your own purposes, reclaim it, sort of fashion it, and then use it to sort of push back against its original, the original party that even brought it into play. And that's essentially something you see happening in the 19th century. That's why I say there's a lot of agency for the colonized in this. So people
Was
often,
there a lot of strategic thinking that went into this?
I mean, clearly, if you look at some of the debates that were happening, and by the 19th century, there were public debates happening in Banaras between Hindu thinkers and missionaries. In Bombay, by the sea, there'd be debates happening, and these are public debates that would get reported in newspapers and so on. And you do see, and by the 19th century, the Hindus were also well read on what the Bible said, so they were also able to counter. Earlier, what would happen is that the missionaries would come in, they would sort of do their research on Hinduism, and they'd use things from within Hinduism to challenge their Hindu rivals. So they'll say, for example, if a Brahmin is defending temple worship, the missionary will be able to say, but your Veda says there are parts of your Veda that is against idol worship or image worship. Then how can you support this? And then the Brahmin is slightly stumped because you're like, okay, how does the missionary even know what our scriptures say? Clearly, he's done his homework. By the 19th century, the Hindus also start doing their homework, and they also start looking at the Bible, etc. And they start asking counter questions. Earlier, also there were instances. For example, they'd say that you worship idols, and then there were Hindu interlocutors who'd say that you've also got processions with the image of the Virgin Mary and so on. Isn't that idol worship? They'll say, oh, your gods have committed all these, like, Krishna, etc., with his gopis. Your gods are not well-behaved gods, with all their romantic dalliances and affairs and carnal instincts and things like that. And they would also find ways to counter it, saying that if Jesus was really God, then how was it that he was put up on a cross? If he's really divine, then he should have been able to do it. Was there no other way in which God could save humanity? Again, these are not my views. These are the debates that are happening. I should clarify, because otherwise someone will say I've given offense to their religion or whatever. But so, by the 19th century, the Hindus are also in a way talking back. They've also done their homework.
So the marketplace that Manu talks about, the spiritual marketplace that you talk about, the competitive spiritual marketplace that you talk about, was also like a public town square of exchange of ideas and back and forth arguments and counter arguments. Very exciting intellectual space, I suppose. Conversion, even today, conversion is such a hot button topic in India in the 21st century. If you picked up the newspaper this morning, you would see Amit Shah has gone and campaigned in Maharashtra, and he's saying, I'm going to bring an anti-conversion law to Maharashtra. Now, it's obviously a very tricky subject. For your book to come out now, do you think this book, A, will get into that kind of public political debate? B, do you think it's safe for a public historian in India today?
I do have a fear that I might get cancelled for this book because of the climate in which we live at the moment, and things might be misinterpreted or misunderstood, etc. But this is just an inquiry into certain topics and so on. Even something like conversion, the people who are doing the conversion, it also caused lots of problems, and they had to also introspect on a lot of things when it happened. For example, missionaries would go out and convert people. Sometimes people would sort of apostatize, saying that, oh, you're against polygamy. No, our culture says polygamy. And then the missionary has to figure out, can I convert them and claim that they're Christians if they're still polygamous? Can I convert them and claim they're Christians if they still hold on to caste? Because a lot of people converting refuse to give up these cultural markers. So that's why I said Christianity also gets altered in the way it works out in the Indian subcontinent, because it's also facing these pressures from below. The people who are coming in are bringing some of their own baggage into the religious system, which the missionaries are not entirely sure how they can handle. So there's that. Certainly, I think conversion, the point is that if you look at the long arc of it, yes, there is, I think, a political side to conversion. At least that's what the evidence suggests. As I said, not everybody converts under pressure. There are lots of people who convert either to escape caste sometimes, and there are cases we find where people are able to stand up to their caste superiors by saying that, no, I've become a Christian now. Doesn't matter, the church still has caste, but having become Christian, I am no longer answerable to you as my feudal caste superiors. So there's a kind of standing up there. One of the figures in the book is Jyotiba Phule in Maharashtra, who essentially, so you have Dayanand Saraswati, Ram Mohan Roy, etc., in a way trying to address the missionary critique. But you also have Jyotiba Phule, who appropriates part of the missionary critique to excoriate Hinduism from within
Right.
and interrogate Hinduism from within in order to call for a different kind of reform. He says, forget the oppressor from the outside. What about oppression within? So there he uses the missionaries' arguments almost in a constructive way to ask Hindus to look at themselves as well. Not just look outwards towards the enemy as they see it on the other side, but what about your
The real
own,
questions that they're raising, let's sort that.
yeah, exactly, caste, internal challenges, etc. Those are the things that he's looking at. So even conversion gets used by different types of Hindu thinkers in different ways.
The threat of conversion.
The threat of conversion, the possibility of conversion. In Kerala, in my first book, The Ivory Throne itself, the Maharaja of Travancore in 1936, has this temple entry proclamation allowing all castes to enter temples. One of the reasons he did it is that the major community called the Iravas threatened to convert to Christianity. They said that we've been agitating for self-respect and rights for a very long time, but nothing seems to be happening, right? Like, why is everything an uphill task? So we're just going to exit the Hindu faith.
Something like the Tanjore Renaissance that you talk about, Sarfoji, what he did, once he's divested of so much land and the British take away the land, so he feels powerless. So he kind of becomes this religious, philosophical, social reformer, educationist. And maybe you want to tell the viewers a little bit about who Sarfoji was and how he used his power and renegotiated his place.
That's the thing again, this encounter with modernity and how modernity happens, right? Modernity also takes root in different parts of the world in different ways. You have Western modernity, but you also have Indian thinkers and figures like Sarfoji in Tanjore, and there were a few others in that period who were able to synthesize Western learning to the degree that they wanted. So again, as I said, agency, they choose, and then blend it with Hindu culture, to blend it with their local practices, etc. And he always created this puzzle in the minds of his white interlocutors, because they would think that, oh, he's very well educated, he speaks English and French, and like is so well read, he knows medicine, he knows botany, he knows all the Western sciences, and yet he sticks to his temple rites, yet he won't allow us into his temples, yet he's doing all his donations to Brahmins, he's building almshouses and Vedic pathshalas, etc. For them it looked like some kind of a weird situation. It's like a man who's so enlightened, in quotes, how can he still be a Hindu? Because in their mind, Hinduism is paganism. It's a backward thing. You should also give that up and, move on to something else. But he doesn't look at it that way. His engagement with modernity is much more selective. It's a selective appropriation of what modernity offers without divorcing yourself from your culture. And I think that's why he's such a fascinating figure. But he's not the only one. Through the 19th century, there are teachers, intellectuals, writers, critics of colonialism who are all doing this. They're accepting Western ideas to a certain extent because they recognize value in it, but they're also trying to synthesize it with what they have familiarly in their own culture and marry the two to come up with an Indian modernity that they recognize, which to them is also culturally rooted. And I think that is also a very fascinating time in Indian history.
Right. And history and identity is all about negotiations, right? Identity is a negotiated identity. What we have today and what we are going to become tomorrow is all continuous process of negotiation. And you mentioned that in your book, one foot in the tradition, one foot in the European gaze. You sidestepped my question. Is it safe for you to be a public historian today talking about conversion?
Well,
or anything else? Is it safe? Is it a safe time to be a public historian?
It's a let's say anxious and fraught time in general to talk about history, because history is very politicized, right? Yeah. History is not just past, it is very present in that sense. We are still renaming cities, we're still fighting over who did what at what period of time, and it's understandable. Societies draw meaning in the present by interpreting and sometimes reinterpreting the past. That's just the nature of the world. That's where the historian really comes in to sort of clarify and nuance things. Is it safe? Well, my very first book got me a defamation notice with like many crores written on it. I had to sort of push back against that. So that was an experience quite early on in my career. I've been cancelled at different points by the right, by the left, but it doesn't matter. Sometimes you say something that upsets the right, sometimes you say something that upsets the left. People will do that. That's the nature of social media, etc. There is sometimes, I once got trolled because I was talking about the Maratha king Chhatrapati Shivaji. But the thing is, when you talk about historical figures, you don't always use their titles, right? So after a point, you say, so Shivaji then did this, and then Shivaji did that. And I remember getting trolled saying, how can you just call him Shivaji? You have to say Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. And it wasn't even insulting. My intention was just to discuss something that he did. It wasn't really about insulting him or anything, but people are oversensitive. But that's perils of the trade. If you are, talking about history, and if you are talking to the public, then I suppose we have to be prepared to deal with some of these things. It's increasingly loud now. There's a certain type of person on social media who's very shrill and very negative and sort of out to attack you no matter what you say. That you sort of tune out and you ignore. But I think there are enough intelligent, sensible people around who are actually interested in the topics, and that makes it worth it.
Yeah, and yet we've had a late emergence of public historians in India. And William Dalrymple recently said that it's because our Indian academics failure that many Indians are moving to what's called WhatsApp history today. Why is he right, and why the delay in the culture of public history in India?
I think it's possible that William may have flattened it a little bit, but I understand what he was trying to say to the extent that we have really good research that is done in academic spaces, but it is not necessarily communicated outside of those academic spaces. At the same time, we have a huge bubbling up of interest in history. As I was saying, because history is political, people are interested in the past. And somehow this good research that's being done doesn't end up coming into this part of the conversation. And this part of the conversation is monopolized largely by populist history. There's a difference between popular history and populist history as well. There can be academic historians also supporting populism and vice versa. So that is the sort of bifurcation that I would make. Yes, I think there has been a communication gap to a certain extent, but WhatsApp history is also growing largely because of other dynamics around us. There's politics involved in it, there's technology involved in it, there are people who are actively pushing out. It's not even an interpretation of history, it is just falsehoods. It's just sometimes lies that are put out. Historical characters are created that we've never heard of. Events that took place in one way get reinterpreted in another way.
Did we lose that battle or win that battle? Even that is up
Exactly.
now.
So it's a strange time in our country. I think what we need is for good historical research to continue, but also to be able to communicate that to interested parties. There are still large numbers of people who are interested in good, well done history. Just the fact of the kind of people who come for the events that people like me speak at. These are not people who are loud on social media. So social media can give you the impression that WhatsApp history is dominating, whereas in reality, I think there's a large constituency that just doesn't come out and say it, participate on social media in the way that the other side does. So these things are not, quite as clean cut. But
have you read Discovery of India by Jawaharlal Nehru?
Many years ago as a student.
Right. So would you say that he was performing the role of a public historian?
That's an interesting question. He was certainly channeling history in order to give the present a certain meaning and emphasis and interpretation. I don't think he saw himself as a historian, engaging with history as such. For him, it was more drawing meaning in the present and trying to understand what kind of India existed in the past.
Nation building.
Nation building. It was part of that. So I think he was more of a political thinker who was marshalling history for a political project, which, as I said, happens. Yeah. Everybody does it. Political parties have ideologies. Ideologies are supported by interpretations of history. Historians go and puncture holes in these ideologies, which is why they get unpopular. But the point is, people do that. That's a reality of the world. It's always been the case. Interpreting and reinterpreting history is a natural phenomenon as far as society is concerned. It will keep happening. What historical research and study does is to try and see how far that's true, identify other things, go into subjects at length, complicate things. Good history is something that complicates your received wisdom on the past.
Thank you, Manu. Lots to unpack from this conversation and also from the book. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you for having me.